Welcome to Building Legendary Leaders, the podcast where leaders leave behind chaos and step into clarity. This is where real stories come alive with the struggles, breakthroughs, and lessons that shape the most effective executives today. Every episode delivers fresh insights you can apply to your own leadership journey. If you are ready to stop putting out fires and start leading with purpose, this is the place for you. Here is your host, Jim Saliba.
So, welcome everyone today to another episode of Building Legendary Leaders. So, let's dive right in. Today's guest has helped build a global movement around Ubuntu with over 60 million users and 350,000 active contributors. He's worked on a $15 million X Prize competition focused on changing human and organizational behavior at scale. He's authored 6 books, and I have one of them myself, also including the award-winning People Powered. Outside of work, he's a musician who plays in a metal band, which tells you a little something about his relationship with creativity, tension, and momentum, and now shapes the future as the founder and CEO of the State Shift, where he helps leaders build movements around companies and products, navigating complex organizational dynamics and unlocking the collective action. Please join me in welcoming Jono Bacon.
Hey, Jim. How's it going?
Oh, it's great to have you here today. It's nice and sunny here in San Jose. Where are you calling from today?
I'm in Walnut Creek, not far away from you, and it is likewise. It's finally stopped raining. It is finally sunny, and this is the Californian dream that I was sold, not the rain.
You know, I was just in New York for the past month in December. I am so glad to be back. It reminds me of the slushy snow that I don't miss, the high of the day being in the low 30s, which I don't miss. It's glad to be back here in California.
Yeah, likewise, likewise.
So today we're unlocking real breakthroughs in the art of leading beyond the obvious. Uh, Here's how we're going to break down today's conversation. Why just copying everybody else really kills innovation, and how leaders get trapped in that whole Me Too thinking. How identifying unexplored solution spaces by paying attention to behavior and not benchmarks, and what leaders must unlearn to move from reaction to original insight. And for those who stay to the end, Jono is going to give us his secret in spotting breakthrough opportunities hiding in plain sight inside of your own organization. Well, I think that is really interesting conversation because there are so many organizations that I talk to, leaders of product, and they get so stuck into the checklist that my other competition has these things and I have to have it too. It's amazing how much of us is doing that. But you have a different way. You are looking for greater breakthroughs, going in a different direction. Why don't you just tell us how that came about?
Yeah, so when I was 19, I was living at home with my parents, about to go to university, and my brother Simon came to stay with us for a couple of weeks, and he introduced me to this operating system called Linux, which was very much in the early days, this ultra nerd fest. And what I was mesmerized by was people all over the world kind of come together to build this software, and they put it out on the internet as open source. And what I found fascinating about this was it was the antithesis of what we knew at that time. Like what we knew back then was companies write software, they sell software, they make money. And I found that notion of a seemingly irrational, unusual approach to things interesting because it generated, I mean, such a profound impact in the world where the vast majority of companies who are delivering software now are doing it with open source software. The underlying seedling that I found interesting in that whole thing was this notion of communities, of people coming together to build things. And it took me years to realize that what attracted me to community is just one manifestation of essentially taking a more psychological rather than economic approach to solving problems. So what I mean by that is, if you look at most companies, companies are defined by the economic model, right? You have to make money, otherwise your company doesn't exist anymore. And that's completely fine, and that's how we should evaluate the success of companies. But what makes products fun and engaging and exciting in many cases are not connected to the economic model. It is communities, and it's engagement, and it's all those different elements that are difficult. You can't model in a spreadsheet. So to me, what businesses need is they need a balance of both. How do we show predictable, measurable results? But then how do we bring that kind of like out of the box thinking into it? And that's where you build like really memorable companies and memorable products.
It's interesting because back at that time, I worked for a company called Computer Associates, known as CA, and I was very involved in leading the company in open source communities. I was the one that looked at the communities that were out there, which ones should we get involved in, which ones we really should double down and be extremely involved. I was on the board of Eclipse and OMG, which is not oh my god today, but object management systems. And I was very involved in it, and that's when I bought one of your books at the time about community. But things have really moved on and changed quite a bit since then. Open source is here. It's everywhere. We don't even talk about it that much anymore because we just know that it's there.
Yeah. What and that to me is what's interesting is if you'd have um and people did do this back then, when people looked at this kind of open source methodology of making software, it did not fit the standardized economic model of how you run a business. And that to me is what's so interesting about this is the behavioral economics of how we are psychologically interested and attracted to things is in many cases at odds with at odds with the kind of historical kind of approaches to business. I'll give you an example of this. A lot of companies, they focus on figuring out like who is the average user that we're designing for, that we're solving for. The average user doesn't exist. It's a phantom, And the problem is that when we only focus on the average, is that it narrows the solution space in which we can create interesting things to that average. Whereas in many cases, the real innovation happens on the edges, and then you look at what happens on to solve problems for a relatively small number of people that can actually apply to the rest. Like a wheelchair ramp, yeah, it might be designed for people in a wheelchair, but it's still useful for people with strollers or carrying heavy bags or whatever of groceries or whatever. So to me, that's been something that I've always been really passionate about. Here is what is that weird, like, squishy ground where we can stand out? And I think when companies do this really well, and there's so many examples of this, they're able to compete in markets where really they shouldn't. If they don't have the quality or they can't compete on price, they can actually compete in these kinds of areas.
It's interesting because that whole movement of community that started with open source has moved into different areas now that the internet now allows as it grows. You look at social media, it's all about community. I was talking to someone earlier today who really brought blogging into thought leadership. Well, what does that do? It builds communities. And it's interesting, I saw a photograph of the Earth, the United States at night, and you could see the lights that are on. And of course, you see groups of lights that are really together for the cities and a lot of darkness in between. We as humans live for community. Without community, we don't survive. So that community drives us to do many, many different things. And I think part of that is what drives us to be, well, somebody else has this, I need it too.
Yeah, yeah. The thing that I always found fascinating about communities, and we see this today, this is the kind of work that we do with our customers at StateShift, is community is this kind of unfathomable weird thing that we all know. We know it when we see it. right? It's like the whole definition of pornography, like you know it when you see it, right? Um, and it's the same thing with communities. But then you take this, and the magic of communities is not the stuff that we measure in a spreadsheet. I mean, active user rate, the size of the community, support ticket deflection, all that stuff is really valuable. But the stuff that people really treasure in that is that sense of connection and kindness and belonging. So to me, when we can take the analog and we can interface it with the digital mechanism in which we measure companies, that's when we get the right balance. And I think what it requires is us turning thinking on its head. Like, I'll give you an example. James Dyson, when he had a meeting one time years ago where the people who were running his support center showed up with all the usual benchmarks around how the support center was doing, and the average ticket duration and resolve time and SLAs and all this kind of stuff. And it was all about, like, efficiencies. It was presented as a cost center, and the leadership team were getting brownie points for reducing those costs. James Dyson's viewpoint was, no, we're not going to think of it in that way. When our customers reach out to us, it's a privilege. It's an opportunity for us to show up and engage and build a relationship. And he reframed that in much the same way that Steve Jobs reframed how computer products should have appeared. Dell versus Dell MP3 versus the iPod, totally different value proposition. So to me, that's what's crucial in this thinking for leaders, is we have to think of it through that lens.
I see this all the time talking to leaders every day. We get focused on KPIs and what we're measuring, and we're measuring the wrong things often. We're measuring output, not outcomes. And outcomes is really what businesses really need. So one of the things that we talked about as in the agenda is how to get people to think more innovative and not use those standard KPIs or measurements that get trapped into Me Too thinking. What are you doing in that area?
So to me, the way I approach this with both my company, State Shift, as well as the people we work with, because we work with big companies like IBM and Dynatrace and Comcast and Adobe. Then we work with lots of earlier stage companies, and that unexplored solution space, the approach to it varies significantly depending on the size of the company. I forget who said it, but somebody once said, to innovate in a large company, the only way to do that is through civil disobedience. Is that the constraints of the company are so overwhelming and so bureaucratic. That's the only way to do it. And I actually think that's reasonably true. And I think there's ways to have civil disobedience in a company and not get fired. But in an earlier stage company, it's totally different, right? You are living in the land of unexplored solution spaces in many ways. To me, what it all boils down to is a really fundamental understanding of who your audience is, both in terms of the kind of stuff that people would talk about at Harvard Business School, such as their needs and their challenges and their fears, but also just the realistic psychological world that we live in. For example, let's be honest, between Christmas and New Year, nobody's working, right? Some people go to work and they have to go to work. But the reality is nobody's really dialed in. Nobody's really paying attention in those days. Yet we tell ourselves this fiction that people are showing up and operating like it's any other day, whereas it really isn't, because a lot of your colleagues are out of the office. You're kind of in vacation mode. And I think we need to take the same kind of approach to how we think about what our customers want. Um, you know, an example of that could be, oh yeah, our customers will probably go through this like onboarding process because it's really clear and it's distilled, not realizing that most people are lazy. Most people are not interested in going through 5 steps. They want to do it in one step. So we have to, I think, taking that realistic view of everything is crucial. And then all we do is we then go hog wild with coming up with ideas. It has to be as part of a group in my mind. You can't do this alone, because it's like great music. Like, bands are always better than solo artists. And then when you come up with those ideas, I think the key thing is then validating those ideas in the cheapest, lightest possible way, even with messaging can be the most effective way of doing it. That's how we generally boil it down.
So, how have you seen organizations do this switch from just checking the box, the other guy has it, I need it to really exploring different solution spaces?
So I think it almost always has to come down to vision. and having a leader with a vision. I think innovation is not something in my mind that you can boil down into a step-by-step guide. I don't think you can write a book about how to be innovative. Martin Luther King didn't say, "I have a plan." He said, "I have a dream." And I think it has to start with that vision. And that vision can come from anywhere. It can come from great engineers, great marketing people, great designers, founders, whatever else. And I think the way in which you develop that vision is exposing yourselves to really fun and interesting and creative ways in which other people have solved problems in different ways. Like I, as a founder, I try to do this. Like I'll watch TED Talks and I'll just watch videos on YouTube of just like really curious, interesting things that people didn't know. I watched something today about this group that have modeled New York City in Minecraft. And the first thing I thought was, I mean, I don't care about Minecraft, but how did they coordinate that? Like, how did they? That's a big, audacious, hairy goal. How did they approach doing that? And that got me thinking about things that we could do. Like maybe we at Station, we should try and do something like that. That would be really fun and interesting and engaging. So to me, I think the key thing is there has to be vision, and then once the vision's there and there's a end in sight, the rest of it, honestly, I think can broadly come down into program management and project management, but just starting really simple and iterating. I think the worst thing that somebody can do is do, I mean, talking about Dyson, what Dyson did with creating these stupid headphones that have got like a ventilator attached to them. They came up with this during COVID. It was very innovative. But they leapt to the market with that first. Nobody bought it. Nobody cared about it. And they could have tested that, I think, in a much lighter weight variety and, without having to build a whole kind of product line around it.
Oh, I love that. I talk to product all the time, and I'm big into experimenting. I love the word experimenting. I hate when people say, "Oh, let's do a pilot and see what happens," or "We'll try this and see what happens." And 6 months later, you ask them, "Well, what happened to it?" And it's like, "I don't know." Experiment has that whole scientific connotation to it, which starts with, "I think that" if I do X, I'm gonna get Y. And I then challenge them to say, okay, what is the cheapest, lightest, fastest way we could prove or disprove that hypothesis without building a whole new product and product line and spend research and months and years and to find out that I spent, I don't know, I've seen companies spend tens and tens of millions of dollars to put something in the marketplace for it to do nothing, where they could have found out a long time ago.
It's so funny you say that, Jim, because I was so guilty of this. And I think a lot of this honestly comes from a bit of kind of arrogance. Like, in the early stages of State Shift, I'd sit down with my team, we'd come up with all these what we thought were really cool ideas of things that we should do. And then we'd be so excited about the idea, we'd go and spend the time and the money investing in building it. And then we'd realize that none of our customers actually cared about it at all. And what I realized in that journey was, and this is kind of where I think a little bit of arrogance kind of comes in, is that we think of ourselves as really understanding our audience better than anybody because they're our audience. We work with them directly every day. So therefore, and we think of ourselves as being smart people. So therefore, there's a high likelihood, a high probability that the idea will work. And it took a number of times the idea not working to realize that um, no, it's again, like there's a logical usually the good idea is logic, but the failure of the good idea is because of the irrational elements of human nature. So start small and work up from there.
Right, right. When people do that, I call that decision by hippo, which is the decision of the highest paid person's opinion.
I like that.
Right? And it might work for a little while if the person is a visionary. I would say we have some examples like that. Certainly, Apple started that way with a vision, but not everybody has that. So, actually taking something and experimenting and growing it. And of course, if you look at the apps on your phones, that's how they grow today, right? It's not like in my earlier days where we sent out media for a new program and it only went out 8 12 to 18 months in between. Now we get updates every day and it changes. So, but how do we get people from that Me Too thinking, that decision by Hippo, into exploring places to learn? What we kind of talked about in the agenda, what do we need to unlearn? Maybe this is what we need to talk about.
Yeah, I think I think it's a great area of discussion. I think what's interesting about this is that when we look at anything we do in companies, we tend to think in terms of best practices. But the problem with best practices is that they're backward looking, they're retrospectives in nature, and they tell you what worked in contexts that usually don't exist anymore. Whereas when we look at breakthroughs in innovation, that's a departure, right, from a from best practice. Like Netflix was a huge departure from how we used to watch television. Tesla was a huge departure from how we've traditionally, built cars and fueled cars. So I think we need to reframe best practices really more as common practices, and then figure out like, okay, how do we then start experimenting in these different areas to find new ways of working, right? So, and I think what this is all about is like living in uncertainty. So I think if you think to yourself, okay, I have a very clear logical and psychological understanding of what my audience cares about. I think what we need to do is we need to look at what our competitors are doing, and then we need to really look at innovating in the areas where our competitors are not innovating, right? So I'll give you an example of this. I forget the name of the restaurant, but there was a restaurant in the UK, I think it was, where they wanted to kind of become a Michelin star restaurant, and the chef took his team to another restaurant. I think this is something that Rory Sutherland talks about. Went to another restaurant, and he said, "I don't want you to tell me like what this Michelin star restaurant does well. I want you to tell me what they don't do well." And they, at the end, when they debriefed, they said, "Well, the beer menu is not very good. It's kind of boring. Modelo, Heineken, that kind of stuff. And the coffee tastes like airline coffee." So then he said, "Okay, you're my beer sommelier. You're my coffee sommelier." They innovated in those areas. And I think there's so many examples of companies that do this. Figma is another great example of this. When everybody else was creating design software written for designers, Figma instilled cross-site network effects to make a design tool that's actually going to be useful for non-designers. And that's a cross-site network effect, right? You create something for one group that actually ends up being useful for another group. So founders and engineers were like, we love Figma because that actually makes our life easier as well. And nobody else was thinking along those terms. So to me, it's about like not just sitting in the history that we've already had, but then looking into those areas where your competition are not innovating. And then to your point earlier, Jim is saying, what is one thing we can do to validate whether this is something that our audience would like? And that could be a landing page. It could be something really, really small, and just see if there's a little blip of signal there. And then if there's a blip of signal there, add a little bit more meat to that bone, and then a little bit more meat. And then before you knew, you're starting to explore areas that might be very interesting. But to figure out what that's going to be, I think that's where you've got to, that's where you've got to have that vision, and you've got to surround yourself in other people's stories about, how they've innovated and done interesting things.
So what I'm hearing is we have to unlearn what we were doing before. I think we spend more time delivering output instead of outcomes, and this is me too. You're still looking at the competition, but from a completely different lens, in that what don't they have rather than what do they have, and what should I do too?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the key thread that goes through this is that past success for companies, like if you've had a big success, most people like just don't want to screw it up. And past success, the risk of it creates a sense of conviction. And the problem is that conviction is the enemy of curiosity. And curiosity is where we innovate, I think. So that's why I think reframing best practices to common practices, in my mind, is so important. So we don't get constrained by what's worked in the past.
You mentioned the term best practices. To me, that's like the fingernails on the chalkboard every time I hear that. When people tell me, "Oh, that's the industry best practice," I'm like, "Well, if you're a follower, yes." because the leaders already figured it out and they're off onto something else already. They're 2, 3 versions ahead of you, and you're just trying to catch up with what? Mediocre best practices.
Yeah, exactly.
So, what's your secret in spotting those breakthrough opportunities?
I mean, I'm not sure if I do have a secret, if I'm being honest with you. I think part of my British upbringing, I grew up in a very rural, working class part of Northern England. I'd never heard the term entrepreneur until I moved to the US when I was 29. And there was plenty of entrepreneurs nearby, but they tended to be plumbers and builders and people who ran pubs and stuff like that. So when I moved from the north of England to the south of England when I was 11, it was like a massive cultural shift, like a very classist society in the UK. And I started realizing what it was like to kind of a little bit be out of your element a little bit. And one of the things that I've always had this kind of like lifelong kind of like cynicism around is people who just follow the rules for the sake of following the rules. Like, I can't stand restaurants that make you wear a jacket to go in. My view is I should choose whether I'm gonna wear the jacket to kinda go in. I can't stand people who, all they talk I see this all the time on LinkedIn and, especially around here in the Bay Area, that they talk about the grind. Like, they celebrate it's all about working, like, 20-hour days and all the rest of it. To me, it's not about how long you work, it's about how smart you work. It's about working your ass off, but it's about doing it the right way. All these, like, cultural to me, it's empty calories in groups that, whether it's, being pompous and or whether it's being appearing like a grind or whatever it might be. So to me, the I think the benefit of this has been, I don't take any group for face value, but the downside of it that I've had to learn how to manage is, you can turn into a very judgmental human being when you look at other groups in a negative capacity. So what I've learned is to try and look through the lens of like the good and the bad with culture and how people do things. And the reason why I say all of this is I think it's helped me to kind of identify areas where we can differentiate while having the confidence of being your own person, right? So for example, I've been to meetings in t-shirts before because I don't feel like I have to wear a suit to be credible in that meeting. Like I have enough personal self-confidence that I feel comfortable in that. I mean, I'm not, I have, imposter syndrome like anybody else. But to me, it's like I don't see that as a necessary like cost of entry to get into that particular group. So I think then what happens is when you have that kind of mindset, what happens is you show up in industry or you show up at events or whatever, and you look at life through the lens of what will be interesting, what will be exciting, as opposed to being constrained by this predefined set of rules that were probably defined 20 or 30 years ago by some person you never met. And I think that is where things get, in my mind, much more interesting. I think if we feel like we have to adhere to these rules, then we never innovate.
So, let me ask you this. If there's one thing leaders can take away from this conversation and start to apply it next week, what would that be?
What I would suggest would be I think the most important thing to take away is the greatest area. If there was one sentence, it's the greatest areas of where you can bring value to your company or your work and stand out in a way that other people won't stand out is to look at those unexplored areas, is to look at the beer menu and the coffee menu for the restaurant. Um, you know, that to me is the most important thing. And this is just sit down and think in an unconstrained way, what could we do for our target audience that could stand out like that? And you might have 10 ideas and 9 of them might be terrible. But you might settle on one that will really resonate. I think that's the most important thing is don't just look at, where your competition is purely in terms of functionality, because we don't make decisions as humans to whether to use products purely based on functionality.
That's a great lesson for people. I'm gonna turn to a different topic now. Let's get to know you a little bit. You said you grew up in Northern England, um, or tell us a story, and how did that, bring you to where you are today?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I had like a very typical kind of working class upbringing, happy relationship with my family and all the rest of it, but did not grow up around tech, and did not grow up around any kind of formalized training when it came to businesses or anything like that. My dad, he started out as a welder and had about 20 different jobs, one of which was he actually created the first online interactive kiosk for booking test drives in the UK back in the 90s. He was a hypnotherapist at one point, and he was a magistrate at one point. He did all of these different things. So I grew up with seeing a sense of like, oh, if you're interested in doing something, there's a pathway to do it, but also with that kind of, again, working class element, like constriction of, don't get ahead of your skis too much, right? Like just remember who you are, kind of thing. But then the big change for me was when I discovered open source. My brother introduced me to open source software. I was 19 and I felt like any other 19-year-old. Like I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I didn't feel like I had any power or influence in the world, right? And when I discovered open source, and I discovered that there was an environment where I could show up and do something that might be useful to this movement, I was mesmerized by it. It gave me a real sense of agency, and my attraction to bringing people together and building communities. A lot of people weren't doing that in a formalized capacity, whereas I was like, I want to learn everything about this and figure out how to do this in a very systematic kind of way. And that's really what kind of paved the way into the early stages of my career. A big thing for me was, I got drunk in a bar with these two guys who were starting a magazine called Linux Format Magazine, and I said to them, if I write an article for you, would you publish it? And they said, if it's crap, no. But if it's decent, then yeah, we'll consider it. And that went through, and they published my article. And that was the first time when I realized, you know what, just have a go. Like you might fail, but I really at that point had nothing to lose because I'd not achieved anything in my life. And then it was literally like one thing led to another, and it was pure. I feel very fortunate because I was just doing what I thought was fun and interesting, and it was opening up opportunities. But in retrospect, I think it was just a person who's passionate, who has some sense of agency, whether it was me or whether it was the thousands of other people doing the same thing in their world. I think that's what kind of moved things forward. And then I met my wife, who's American, and I moved to the US to live with her. And I didn't really even think at the time, oh, I'm going to be living in the tech epicenter of the world in the Bay Area. I didn't really even think about that when I moved over here. And of course, that opened up other types of opportunities. But part of it was really, again, being a bit of an outsider over here when I first moved over. Because for a number of years, it was like, all these people, they went to Stanford, they went to Harvard, they grew up in venture capital, whatever. I didn't know any of that kind of stuff. But I thought, I'll figure it out. And I figured some of it out, but I've not figured out a lot of it. So
Well, there is a lot to figure out, but it's different journeys for different people. We certainly know that. Um, you are in a band. Tell me a little bit about that.
yeah, I've been a fan of music for ever since I was a kid. Like I became a fan of Iron Maiden when I was about 9 years old, and my friend and I nicked his brother's vinyl and listened to it. And I was mesmerized by this band Iron Maiden, and learned to play the guitar. And my dad was a drummer in his earlier days, but we didn't have anywhere to put drums; they were too loud. And I got into my first band when I was 16 and joined a band. Everyone in that band was in their mid 20s, so again, I was another fish out of water. But I felt like that was a huge opportunity to actually play with like real musicians, as opposed to me and my best mate, who we were both terrible. And then just like we talked about with the career, just like one thing led to another. Started getting to know people. Started another band. When I moved over here, I started an experiment called Severed Fifth, where I basically crowdfunded and recorded an album, and then we gave the music away for free because I had this hypothesis that musicians are not making any money anyway. So give the music away, then you can build a fan base. This was before Spotify, but that's now kind of how things work with Spotify. And then my current band, Baron Carter, I've actually never met my other colleague, my other musicians. I wrote a bunch of songs, recorded them here in my office, And then the singer is actually one of my heroes, who I met during COVID. I took singing lessons from him and then realized I couldn't sing, and asked him if he wanted to play in the band. So him and the drummer, he's in Germany, the drummer's in Denmark. I've never met them, but we could do it online.
So you play in a band and you're all in different countries.
Yeah, it's the internet, baby.
And that works, no latency, and I would figure the timing of all the instruments.
Yeah, it's all recordings. Yeah, it's all recordings. This is one of the things I love about, everybody talks about how AI is gonna kill everything and politics is terrible. I just think that there's so much cool stuff in the world. Like I was able to, in a very affordable way, produce 3 EPs where, our the singers in Germany, the drummers in Denmark, our producers in Manchester in the UK, the woman who does the videos is in Romania, the woman who transcribed the music into tablature is in South Korea. The guy who was running, I had a guy run some Facebook ads so we could raise awareness about it. He's in Romania. I had orchestral arrangements done by somebody who was in Switzerland. Like all of these people are available online and in many cases in a very affordable way for us to create art together or for us to create businesses together. Like I don't think we should ever just be constrained by the people who are in the region that we live in. So
We no longer have that constraint. So this is a great conversation. How can people get in contact with you?
yeah, so you can find out more about my company StateShift by going to stateshift.com. We basically work with a small number of organizations, usually only around 20, to help them build movements, communities, and engagement around what they're doing. People can reach out to me. I'm very open. People can reach out to me at jono@stateshift.com. And then I'm in all the usual spots, LinkedIn and Instagram. I've become an Instagrammer recently. I was kept forgetting to Instagram. And again, open book. Like if I've said anything in here that people are kind of curious about, they're interested in, just drop me an email, and I can promise you that I'll try to be helpful, and I can promise you that you won't get a sales pitch. So
Okay. Jono Bacon, thank you very much for joining us today. Great conversation. I look forward to having you again sometime.
thanks, Jim. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Building Legendary Leaders podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes action, research, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear your insights. Join the conversation and help us shape the future together. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are making a difference for everyone. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe, rate, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too. Thanks for listening, and see you on the next episode.